Hi everyone. So this is the part two of the discussion of the flowers. So part one, if you haven't watched part one, make sure to go back and watch that first. In that one, I just read through the story and give you some basic ideas about what fiction is and an initial discussion about some symbolism. So make sure to look at that first. But if you've already watched that, then we're ready for this one. And let's go through and see some of the comments that I've made here and see how we can figure out some things that are happening in the story. Um, One of the things that confuses students is that we sometimes feel like authors are hiding information from us. We feel like they just don't tell us things directly, which is why you need English teachers to kind of explain things for you because they're all hidden there. But they aren't hidden necessarily. It's just they're there. It's just that we need to know how to pick up on them. So all of the information that you need to understand this story is right here on the page. We just need to kind of slow down and ask the appropriate questions as we come across certain parts of the story. And that's what I'm doing here with the annotation. I've made some comments here about certain things that are going on that help us understand what the story is supposed to mean, how we're supposed to come up with an understanding about what it is. So I mentioned in the previous video that the flowers are a symbol, right? And I talked about that. The idea is that flowers, titles are an indication of what's important. And that if we've got an object here that on some level doesn't matter, flowers, again, they're pretty to look at, but they themselves are not that important, then we realize that they are going to be symbols. And so once you see something like that in a title, one of the things you want to do is look through the rest of the story as you're reading the story and say, where else does this symbol show up, right? Where else does this idea present itself in the story? Because if something's going to be important like that, we're going to talk about it probably a number of times. If you'll remember from Battle of the Breaths, we didn't have a symbol there, we had a metaphor. As we talked about the difference in the earlier video about the difference between symbol and metaphor. But that filmmaker, she used the metaphor of the oil and water, and it didn't come up just once. It came up multiple times, and that's the thing that lets us know that that idea is important. That's something we're supposed to be thinking about. And so if the flowers are going to be important, they're probably going to come up more than once, and so we'll see where that happens. My first comment that I have here over to the right, right there in the first sentence, Mayap skipped lightly from hen house to pig house to smokehouse. And I says, this tells us something about where the story takes place. The authors do not necessarily always say things like, this story takes place in, and they give you a city and they give you a time period or something like that. But they expect us to kind of figure some of those things out. And to have a hen house. A hen house is a place where we keep chickens, usually so we can gather eggs from them. We've got a pig pen, which is where we raise the pigs that their people might eat. And then a smokehouse, as I say down here, it's a small building where meats are smoked to preserve them. It's common when people didn't have access to refrigeration. So that tells you not only something about the place that they are, it's a rural setting. This isn't New York City. Some people might have a hen house in their backyard, chicken coop, but probably not a pig pen, definitely not a pig pen and a smokehouse. And so this is going to be out in the country somewhere. And that they've got a smokehouse says they probably don't have access to reliable refrigeration, which means it's going to be, even out in the country now, most people are going to have refrigeration, and most people aren't going to be smoking their own meat. Some people do as just for fun, but not as a matter of, living, right? The idea that that's how we preserve our meats. So this story is going to take place in a rural area, probably before the 1960s, probably at least the 1950s or so. And so sometime before then. So that gives you a sense about that, right? Then we look down here at the comment that I've made. It says there's the harvest, the whole sentence says the harvesting of corn, cotton, peanuts, and squash. Again, reinforcing that this is out in the country, a rural area where they're growing their own food. But it says in here that each day was a golden surprise. eyes. And I said, notice the mood here. She's happy and enjoying her day. That's not going to last, as we know. But it's important to recognize how the author is telling us how we're supposed to feel about things. We see, oh, this is a nice, seems like a nice, pleasant day, and it didn't come out about magically. The author is including certain elements to let us know that that's what's going on. Down here, it's mentioned sharecropping, turning her back on the rusty boards of her sharecropper cabin. And as I say in here, sharecropping was instituted after slavery was abolished in 1865 and was common in the southern U.S. until the 1960s. Sharecroppers were usually black and worked for a landowner who allowed them to use the land in return for a share of the crops produced. It was a good arrangement for the landowner, but not for the sharecroppers, who found it difficult to escape poverty. So this is just a word that you may not be aware of, and not aware of that historical situation of what sharecropping is, but that does tell you a lot about them. Sharecroppers are poor. They were usually black, and again, it takes place in a certain time period. So if we had questions about where and when the story takes place, and who Mayop is, a lot of those things have been answered here. We understand something about her race, about her social class, things like that. By the way, yeah, so all of that is going to be all that's going to be expressed right there. So we've got the sharecropping, and then down here, again, more about the time and place. The spring where the family got drinking water, right? A spring is a place where water bubbles up out of the ground. You go out in the mountains and places like that. Water comes up out of the ground, and that's where they get their water. They don't have water piped in. Again, gives you a sense of the fact that they're going to be relatively poor. And rural. Down here, I say we've got flowers again, right? They're brought up. As I mentioned, flowers are going to be important. And there she's walking around, and she is going to be picking flowers, right? Arms full of strange blue flowers. All right, so it's a little girl running through the country around her house, having a good time, and she's picking flowers because they're pretty. Again, we still have to think about, wait a minute, are the flowers only about being pretty, or is there something else that's going on in there? But just keep that in mind. It seems we like them. They've got velvety ridges. It seems pretty. She finds a sweet suds. I had a typo in the previous one. It's a sweet suds bush, which is just a with brown fragrant bud, again, kind of a bush that's got flowers on it. Here she's got sprigs of her findings. I just put the definition of that word: a small stem bearing leaves or flowers taken from a bush or plant. So again, she's just out gathering flowers. This whole first half of the story, she's just a little girl out wandering around looking at her flowers, looking at flowers. Then if we look here, I say we have this sentence: it seemed gloomy in the little cove in which she found herself. The air was damp, the silence was close and deep. And I say in here, notice how her surroundings are suddenly not so pleasant. The setting of the story, that is where it takes place, tells us a lot about the mood, right? And so we should recognize from this that something is going on. When something seems gloomy, when just the place around her seems gloomy, then we understand something's bad is going to happen. You understand how setting affects a story because you can see that in things like horror movies. Horror movies usually take place at night and in the woods or someplace, or in a dark, creepy house, right? The setting tells us something bad is going to be happening, right? And so, and usually, you don't have many horror movies, because like Jaws is about that, but most horror movies don't take place on the beach, because a beach is a nice sunny place. They take place, in the dark someplace, and so that gives you the setting gives you a sense of how we're supposed to think about what's going on. So once we get to a gloomy cove, we know that something bad is potentially going on for her. Down here, it says that her heel became lodged in the broken ridge between brow and nose. And I say in here that the word skull is never used, right? But broken ridge between the brow, which is up here like your eyebrows, and the nose, and that's what she steps into. She stepped into somebody's skull. Now, the author never used the skull. She kind of wants us to come to that, and that's one of the things that might have been potentially confusing, right? We're like, what? Her heel became, what are you talking about? But realize that if we look very carefully at that, we can understand that she is stepping into the skull of a human being, right? And then it's only saw his naked grin. right? Naked because there's no skin on his face, that she gave a little yelp of surprise. There's a 10-year-old girl who stepped into a human skull. It's a pretty frightening thing, right? But again, I can see how we might have been confused about this because we might have looked at this and not realized that she was actually stepping into a skull. So let's see what we can learn about this man whose skull she steps into. He'd been a tall man, all of that. And then it says down here he had large white teeth, all of them cracked or broken. How did his teeth get cracked or broken, right? Sounds like something violent potentially happened to him. So again, little clues that we're supposed to be picking up to let us understand about what's going on here. Here's the skull of a person lying out in the woods. His teeth are broken, so it suggests that something was violent. All his clothes had rotted away, right? So this happened a long time ago. The buckles had turned green. That's from tarnishing metal. Certain kinds of metals, when they stay outside, are going to change colors, right? So it's been a long time. And then coming down here into this last paragraph, we've got another flower, right? Near where she stepped into his head was a wild pink rose, right? And so again, these flowers seem, we said they're potentially symbolic, and right next to his head is a wild rose, right? And so again, we're supposed to be thinking about how those flowers become symbolic about what's going on. And then down here we said it was the remains of a noose. And this noose is takes into account a lot of things, right? Understanding what the noose is. And so you see that I've got a pretty long comment here. And in fact, in the folder, I have 2 videos that you can watch about lynching, right? Lynching, I said noose is a rope, a long rope used to hang people, and I said this man had been lynched. Lynching, sorry, I have a typo there. It says lynching. It says lynching is to kill someone for an alleged offense without a legal trial, right? From the end of the Civil War and well into the 20th century, blacks were often lynched as a way of terrorizing them and other blacks in the community. And there's a memorial to lynching victims in Montgomery, Alabama. And so you've got those 2 videos that you can look at. But the idea here is that this man was killed by being lynched, right? Which is, you would just have mobs who would come out and kill somebody, kill a black man, or usually men, but sometimes women as well, for alleged crimes, right? Sometimes they weren't even crimes. They were just not being respectful of whites or something like that. And so this is how this person died, in a very unjust way. And so that's what we're supposed to be keeping in mind here, that here this little girl is out walking in the woods. It seems like a great day, and she stumbles upon this man who's been killed by lynching, through racial violence, and how that changes her. So it's really important to just recognize that, again, sharecropping tells you something about the time period and some of the racial situation. Noose tells you a lot about that. So it's just those 2 words that tell us a lot about that. And those words have big concepts behind them that help us understand what's going on. Then we get down here, she laid down her flowers, right? Notice that we began with flowers and we're ending with flowers. She's picking up the flowers all the way through. They're so beautiful. She's having a good time. She's laying them down. It's kind of like she's maybe putting that beauty down. And then we get the idea summer was over, right? Well, summer just doesn't end right then suddenly, right? That's not how seasons work. And so we can think to what extent, as I say in the comments here, to what extent I say summer doesn't just end right away, so this can't be literal. We really aren't talking about actual summer ending. What are we talking about? What does summer represent, right? Summer is a time when things are beautiful outside. Life is easy. I mean, she's wandering around through the woods on her own, having a great time. That's what summer is about. And to what extent is this summer that we're talking about really about her thinking about her childhood, right? Because she was a child and she can be carefree, but she is going to wake up to the reality of the racial violence around her, right? The fact that people in her community can be killed for no reason by mobs. So that's kind of how this works, right? We take those flowers and we use them as a symbol of this, something that becomes rather on one level is beautiful to her, and but when she by the time we get to the end, they begin to represent something else. We use flowers at a funeral. I mean, she's kind of mourning this person, something like that. And so that's how the flowers get used as a symbol throughout this story.